Rene Cassin is the Jewish Voice for Human Rights. It's a small charity, and we work to use the experience really that Jewish people have had of persecution, intolerance, human rights abuses, to advocate for other minorities who are facing similar persecution. We're based in Golders Green, and we do a mixture of campaigning, lobbying, and also education to share knowledge about human rights issues from a Jewish point of view. I'm hoping that you have been able to see the film. It's called Sunrise, Not Sunset, and I wrote and produced it. It's not a true story, but it is inspired by a true story. And the true story was a couple called Mr. and Mrs. Driscoll, and they were being sent to separate care homes despite being very dependent on each other. What I put into the film did really happen, which is that they had a demonstration, that they got the media involved, and social services changed their mind when they started looking at the decisions about where to place them in the context of human rights. And I had somebody say to me, gosh, but that was very easy. You know, they didn't have to go to court. They you know, it was relatively limited what they had to do. But the fact is that if you talk to a public authority about human rights, they won't necessarily do what you want, but they will have to consider it. And it could be as little as you might not even have to do the demonstrating at the media. You might just have to talk to them about it. So where does all this human rights stuff come from? Well, it won't surprise you to know that it comes from what's clearly a very Jewish experience, which is the Second World War and the Holocaust. What people came out of that saying was, never again should we have a situation where the state can abuse individuals' rights in that way. That's one of the first points really in terms of human rights. We probably wouldn't have this human rights legislation if it hadn't been for the Holocaust. So what happened was that in 1948, a man called Monsieur Rene Cassin, who was a French Jewish lawyer and judge, drafted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And in a way, that's our second link to Jewishness. There are a lot of lawyers, Jewish lawyers, involved with human rights treaties, and Rene Cassin is the key one, and you'll recognize that that's the name of our organization. And the Universal Declaration of Human Rights had a number of very clear rights in terms of how the state needed to protect individuals, but it was basically, it's a piece of paper, it's a lovely piece of paper, but there's no way of then making the state accountable for protecting your rights. So you could say, but you've breached my rights in the Universal Declaration, but there's nothing you can actually do about that. So in 1951, a number of people across Europe produced the European Convention of Human Rights. And the people who did that included Winston Churchill, David Maxwell Fyfe, who was the Attorney General in the UK. So the suggestion that the European Convention of Human Rights has come from Europe and not from Britain is undermined really by history. And in fact, the UK was the first country to sign up to the European Convention on Human Rights, and that was in 1951. And the big difference between this convention and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was that this convention has a court. It's the European Court of Human Rights, and the European Court of Human Rights is in Strasbourg. And so it means that if you believe that your country, your state, has breached your human rights under the convention, you can go to court, the court in Strasbourg, and judges there, which include judges from all over Europe, will make a decision on your case. But it takes time and money to go to the European Court. So in 1998, the European Convention on Human Rights was incorporated into domestic law, into British law, and was named the Human Rights Act. And it was brought in by, it was a Labour government at the time, but the other parties voted for it as well. And it actually came into force in the year 2000. what rights are we talking about? I've just listed a few of them. There's lots more than this, but these are maybe the key ones. So the right to life, freedom from torture, right to liberty, right to a fair trial, respect for private and family life, and freedom of thought, freedom of religion, of expression, of association. And if you think back to what happened in Nazi Germany and in relation to the Holocaust, you can see how these rights were incredibly important. So now I'm going to talk a bit more about how those mechanisms work by introducing you to some cases that demonstrate how the Human Rights Act works. So you may recognize Naomi Campbell. So Naomi Campbell took the Mirror group to court and she said that the Mirror had breached her right to privacy because they had published information about her going to a meeting of Narcotics Anonymous. And the Mirror said they hadn't breached her right to privacy. What they had done was use their right to freedom of expression. And the judge had to balance those rights. The judge had to consider whether Naomi's rights to privacy overruled the Mirror's rights to freedom of expression. And this is something that the Human Rights Act is very good for, is a way of balancing people's rights. This is Jan Sutton. Her situation is a bit more similar to the couple that you saw in the film. So Jan had multiple sclerosis, and the local authority, the local council, only gave her sufficient care hours for her to have help getting up and washed and dressed, eating her meals and going to bed. And she had no time to do anything else with her life. And she took the local council to court and said that they're breaching her right to private and family life. And the court ruled in her favour. And because of that, the council provided more care hours for her, which meant that she could see her grandchildren and have a friend over to lunch and basically just do more things in her life that she wanted to do, which actually ended up including being a very strong human rights activist. Ordinary situations, really. I'm sure a number of us have had parents or grandparents going into care homes or know people who've got serious illnesses or disabilities that need care. And by using the Human Rights Act, we can often get a better solution. So the cases I've talked about have involved either just raising the issue or going to court. When the Human Rights Act came in, they said that any future laws had to comply with the Human Rights Act. So every time a new law comes in, Parliament looks at it, it's the Joint Committee of Human Rights, looks at it and makes sure that it's compliant with the Human Rights Act. But what they didn't do in 1998, and you can see why, is go back over all the old laws, all the previous laws, and check whether they were compliant with the Human Rights Act. But they did put in a mechanism that makes this work. And this young man, Hughes Chang, his case is a very good example, I think, to demonstrate how that mechanism works for changing laws to make them, old laws, to make them compliant with the Human Rights Act. So what happened to Hughes was he was 17 and he got arrested for theft of a mobile phone, which he hadn't actually done, and he was kept in a police cell for 12 hours without being able to call his mother. If he'd been charged, he would have been able to call his mother, and if he'd been tried, he would have gone to a youth court, so they would have treated him as a child because he was under 18. But there was an anomaly in the rules, and if you just got arrested but not charged, they would treat you as an adult because you're over 16. It actually went all the way to the High Court, and the judge said the police had breached the Hughes's right to private and family life because he was young, he was vulnerable, and he needed a parent or an appropriate adult with him at such a stressful time. And the judge said that the police rules were therefore incompatible with the Human Rights Act and had to be changed. Now, what's interesting about this mechanism is the judge couldn't just strike down those rules. The judge can't just strike down a law that is not compatible with Human Rights Act. But what they can do is state that it's incompatible, and then it goes back to Parliament, and they have to do something about it. And in the end, the police rules were changed so that people who are arrested but not charged are treated as children until they're 18. And the significance of that is that 75,000 17-year-olds are held in police custody each year. And this has changed the law for all of them. But in particular, what that shows is how one person has managed to change the law to make sure that it's compatible with the Human Rights Act. And when those important people in Europe were writing the European Convention on Human Rights, I'm sure they never thought that one thing that would be brought in through the Human Rights Act and through their convention was equal marriage, and so that gay people can get married, which is obviously a very recent law. The reason that's happened is because the European Convention on Human Rights is a living instrument, and it's intended to be interpreted in a way that works alongside today's social mores and the current ideas about how people live. So although it was written in the 50s, the European Convention of Human Rights is not stuck in the 50s. So those are all sort of what I call good news stories, positive things that have happened to ordinary people that could have happened to any of us, any of our families. But you wouldn't think so if you just looked at the headlines. Apart from the gay marriage and Naomi Campbell, because she's a celebrity, but most of those cases I've told you about didn't particularly get into the news. Meanwhile, these have been the headlines about the Human Rights Act, and you can see they're very, very negative. And one of the things they do is they particularly pull out people who the media, it seems, think have not got a right to human rights. That includes terrorists, criminals, includes foreign prisoners, can include asylum seekers, and all those people do have human rights. They have a right to a fair trial, for example, if you've committed a terrorist act. But there's been this very bad press, and the good news stories that I've been sharing with you and that my films show sort of portray this other side of the Human Rights Act. But just before I go on to that, I'm just going to answer one question, which is, have we lost the European Convention on Human Rights because of Brexit? And the answer is no. So the European Convention on Human Rights, and through that the Human Rights Act, come through the Council of Europe. It doesn't come through the European Union. So the Human Rights Act is domestic law, so that's irrelevant in a way to the EU, and the European Convention on Human Rights is Council of Europe law, so we've still got that despite Brexit. So meanwhile, in terms of politics, for the last 10 years, the Conservative Party has in its manifesto talked about scrapping the Human Rights Act and basically repealing it, getting rid of it. More recently, in their latest manifesto, they talk about updating the Human Rights Act. The worry about them saying they'll update it is that we know they're not going to update it for the better. They're going to weaken it. If it hadn't been for the pandemic, they would have been working on this now. So one of the things that we're working on at Rene Cassin, and lots of other human rights organisations is going to be advocating and lobbying to maintain the Human Rights Act as it is, to keep the Human Rights Act intact. Just finally, as you hopefully have seen, the notion of human rights came directly out of the experience of the Holocaust, and obviously that was a huge experience for Jewish people. Also, it was written by lots of Jewish lawyers. And it's also, it's not just what the headline says. It is available and it can benefit ordinary people in their ordinary lives. And I'd like to finish with a quote from Eleanor Roosevelt, who was also involved in writing the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And she said, "Where, after all, do universal human rights begin? In small places, close to home."